Potstirrer podcast, where politics, religion, and history collide, and it's not always polite. When North Korean leader Kim Jong-il died in 2011, footage was shown on the news of North Koreans openly weeping and wailing in the streets. A communist haven since the late 1940s, North Korea has been an isolated dictatorship since the ceasefire in 1953 that halted the Korean War. It has been ruled since by Kim Il-sung and his descendants, including the current leader Kim Jong-un. Even today, despite the starvation, oppression, and lack of freedom the people face, they still stay openly devoted to their leader. In the United States, we are not forced to show open devotion to our leaders for fear of oppression, arrest, or death, as they do in North Korea. But devotion to leadership and personality, instead of principles and values, is very dangerous, especially in a democratic republic, because when those in power behave without principle, without any regard for the rule of law, and those who can stop it choose not to, the republic is lost. I am your host, Jaye Pool. Donald J. Trump recently conducted his first international tour since becoming president. While insulting our allies, cozying up to despots, and working on an arms deal with Saudi Arabia, yes, that Saudi Arabia that actually has exported terror, stateside, his administration continues to be under investigation for its ties to Russia. Both chambers of Congress are holding hearings into the matter, and in addition, the Justice Department has appointed former FBI Director Robert Mueller as special counsel to investigate Trump administration collusion with Russia, an appointment the administration is fighting. At the same time, Trump met with Russian officials without allowing American press and boasted about the intel he receives, including intelligence supplied by Israel. And before you think that Israel was okay with this, note that while Israel Prime Minister Benjamin Netanyahu was glowing on Trump canceled his meeting with Israel's parliament out of concern that he would be heckled. On the domestic front, the Congressional Budget Office scored the most recent version of the American Health Care Act, or Trumpcare, the one House Republicans celebrated along with Trump and Vice President Mike Pence in the White House Rose Garden. The CBO score has an estimated 23 million Americans losing insurance, down by 1 million people, but still a larger number than those who gained insurance due to the Affordable Care Act, meaning that this is worse for the public than what we had prior to the ACA. And due to the pre-existing condition and community ratings waiver options, the insurance that may be offered in a number of states, estimated as about a third of states that will most likely seek the waivers, may not cover a multitude of pre-existing conditions, leading to many more Americans being underinsured, having insurance but the insurance not covering care for the illnesses and conditions they suffer from. And right now, instead of the Democratic Party leadership making a united effort to resist the Trump presidency, Trumpcare, and other decisions by Trump and the Republican Party that are not just different, but wrong, deadly, and dangerous, the party leadership, including DNC Chair Tom Perez, have shown that they have learned absolutely nothing from November 2016. Very few people are aligned 100% with the views of the Democratic or Republican Party. There is a difference between including an issue such as abortion as part of your party's platform and making it clear, as Tom Perez has done, that people who disagree on that one issue are not welcome in the Democratic Party, whether as supporters, candidates, or office holders. As I said in episode 1, the foundation of the Democratic Party is labor. We need to get back to that. The party's planks should include all liberal positions, to be sure. If nothing else, it should be a counter to the all-conservative positions of the Republican Party. No one is stating that reproductive choice should no longer be a part of the Democratic Party platform, but recognize that the United States is a two-party system. In a multi-party system we generally see in parliamentary politics, parties can get away with being a one or two issue party because they frequently form coalitions with other parties to pass legislation. But in the winner-take-all, two-party system we have in the United States, you are either in or you're out. Understand the game you're playing. Focusing on one plank as a shibboleth will not only keep out conservatives who won't support the Democrats anyway, it also keeps out the people who agree with 90% of the Democratic platform but disagree with positions on only one or two issues. If the Democrats want to be about ideological purity instead of going back to its roots, they will lose every single time. Look, the United States is in a crisis of leadership. We have an executive that fears nothing, and legislators on both sides who make no real effort to stop it. But this is nothing new. The imperial executive, the increase in power given the executive branch in relation to the other branches of government, especially the legislative branch, has been decades in the making. And while previous presidents have surely abused this increase in power, Trump is not the first. There was a level of restraint, discipline, and understanding shown, at least in public, that obscured how much power the president really had, which is more than the founders ever intended. Trump has merely shown what happens when you hand the keys to the imperial presidency to a person with no restraint, no discipline, and no understanding. And also what happens when the checks and balances begin to break down over what the founders called faction. In Federalist Paper number 10,
among the numerous advantages promised by a well-constructed union, none deserves to be more accurately developed than its tendency to break and control the violence of faction. The friend of popular governments never finds himself so much alarmed for their character and fate as when he contemplates their propensity to this dangerous vice. Complaints are everywhere heard from our most considerate and virtuous citizens, equally the friends of public and private faith, and of public and personal liberty, that our governments are too unstable, that the public good is disregarded in the conflicts of rival parties, and that measures are too often decided not according to the rules of justice and the rights of the minor party, but by the superior force of an interested and overbearing majority. However anxiously we may wish that these complaints had no foundation, the evidence of known facts will not permit us to deny that they are in some degree true.
And while our political institutions are breaking down, some of our religious institutions are falling apart also. A couple weeks back, Jerry Falwell Jr., president of Liberty University and the son of late Lower Majority Leader Jerry Falwell, stated that Donald Trump is the evangelicals' dream president. In addition, according to a survey by the Pew Research Center, white evangelicals who attend church regularly register some of the highest support for Donald Trump. Donald Trump, a man who has stated that he is not in need of forgiveness, a man who has 5 children by 3 women, 2 times divorced, has had a history of philandering, has spoken in crude terms about what women allow him to do to them. A man who has, along with the rest of the GOP, shown support for taking away health care and other social support for the least of these. A man who has pushed for a wall as a cornerstone of his presidency instead of sanctuary, and has sought to detain and turn back refugees fleeing terror while authorizing shallow actions that are little more than pyrotechnics in their support. A man who has installed someone as chief cop with a history of virulent racism who wants to reverse drug policy and send more minorities and poor people to prison. A man who has demonstrated a fondness for a country run by oligarchs who oppress their own minorities, gays and lesbians, and the press. A man who was pro-choice for decades up until he held up the mantle of being against abortion for conservative votes. If Donald Trump is really evangelicals' dream president, then such evangelicals have no interest in following Christ. Several years ago, I wrote my doctoral dissertation exploring why white evangelicals and black Protestants had similar views on religious beliefs and personal morality, but tended to support different political parties. The prevailing theory at the time was that blacks' partisanship is due to race, while whites' partisanship is due to religion. What I theorized, and what the evidence bore out, is that race matters for whites as well as blacks. It's just that for whites, evangelical Christianity tends to amplify conservative racial attitudes. And sadly enough, time has made this more evident. The 2016 presidential election had very little culture war rhetoric compared to elections past. Trump did not run a religious campaign. He did not do like President George W. Bush and claim that he was called by God to run, or use a lot of religious imagery, or say that he was a compassionate conservative. And the movement that made the argument that Bill Clinton's immorality dishonored the Oval Office said nothing for Trump's. Trump's campaign embraced an alt-right platform that is not religious, but explicitly focused on white nationalism and white supremacy. The rhetoric exploited prejudices and gave comfort to racists. And some of the bigger names in the evangelical movement, like Falwell and Franklin Graham, endorsed him while others remained silent. But whether in co-signing this or in their silence, too many leaders in the American church refused to call out sin. And too many conservative Christians made the choice to put Donald Trump over Jesus Christ. Potstirrer Podcast will be back after this. Did you know for today's episode, North Carolina is a state that is relatively balanced between Republican and Democratic voters, but the state legislature has had Republican supermajorities since 2010. In 2016, Democrat Roy Cooper was elected as governor, and the state legislature responded by stripping the governor of several powers just prior to taking office, some of which he filed a lawsuit in order to get back. The state legislature has also moved to take actions against Democrats deemed to be vindictive, such as keeping school funding the same, but stripping funding specifically from schools and districts controlled by Democrats. But did you know that the U.S. Supreme Court recently handed down a decision that struck down their efforts at racial gerrymandering? In 2011, the North Carolina legislature's efforts at redistricting following the 2010 census included 2 districts that had a thin, snake-like appearance. These 2 districts were districts where the legislature packed in the state's black population in order to dilute their overall influence in congressional elections and maximize Republican advantage. After a 6-year court battle that took the case to the U.S. Supreme Court, the court voted 5-3 that these districts were unconstitutional. The surprising part about the ruling to many observers was that Justice Clarence Thomas, who is a very conservative member of the court, sided with the court's liberal justices. You know you messed up royally if Clarence Thomas says your map is racially biased. Now, back to Potstirrer Podcast. No one can serve 2 masters. Either you will hate the one and love the other, or you will be devoted to the one and despise the other. You cannot serve both God and money. Matthew 6:24. I've seen a number of progressive Christians argue that Trump's support among white evangelicals is proof that white supremacy is the idol of the evangelical church. White supremacy is America's sin because the country was built on it and it refuses, like a thorn in our side, to go away. And to be fair, the church in America historically has been both a force for racial progress and complicit in the racial status quo. But beyond that, I would say that the idol of the American church, specifically the evangelical church, is much more basic. It is power. At its very core, it is about having power. It was never about morality. It was never about integrity or faith principles or right and wrong. It was always about power. The leadership of the religious right, powered by the evangelical church, has been exposed as morally and spiritually bankrupt. For the evangelical church, it is a perilous place to be because, according to the Bible, this can leave the church open to divine judgment. Attempting to divide loyalties is a non-starter, not only for the church, but for political and civic life. Trump's struggle to serve both Russia and the United States his personal ego or the American people, is clearly not working. And if most of us are completely honest, it is very clear this is not working. And it is not heading anywhere good for our country. We need to make it very clear to our leaders, both Republican and Democrat, that the time for talk or for expressing disappointment or for condemning in the strongest terms is over. This is not about politics. This is not about my candidate didn't get in or but we won fair and square or let's leverage this mess for 2018 or 2020. Richard Nixon was almost impeached and chose to resign, and Bill Clinton was impeached for less than this. Donald Trump needs to be impeached and removed or compelled to resign now for the good of the United States of America. In the words of Reverend Dr. Martin Luther King Jr., the time is always right to do right. Potstirrer Podcast is on iTunes and Google Play. Subscribe, and if you enjoy the show, please leave a review. Like Potstirrer Podcast on Facebook. Follow the show on Twitter at PotstirrerCast and Instagram at Potstirrer Podcast. I'm Jaye Pool. Let's fight for America's future because freedom is not free.